The tower had been frozen for 3 days when I saw the light moving through the trees. Not the pale silver of moonlight on snow, but the warm amber of flame. Deliberate, purposeful, alive. I stood at the narrow window, my breath turning to ice on the stone, watching that distant torch weave between the dark trunks like a thread of hope in an endless white tapestry. The cold had crept so deep into the tower's bones that the walls themselves seemed to exhale frost. My fingers were numb, my thoughts slower than they should have been. But that light, that single point of warmth in a world that had forgotten heat, pulled me back from the edge of surrendering to the cold. My name is Edmund. And I was there, trapped in that frozen tower, when everything I thought I knew about survival began to unravel. Before you hear the rest of this story, I need you to do something for me. If you're finding comfort in these words, if this journey speaks to something in you, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one. Tales of survival, of finding family in the most unexpected places, of learning that warmth comes not just from fire, but from the people who choose to share their light with you. I had been a scribe in the monastery. At Lindsay, copying texts by candlelight, my world measured in ink and vellum. The abbot sent me north with a message for a sister house, a journey that should have taken 10 days in autumn weather. But autumn had betrayed me. The first snow came early, violent and without warning, turning familiar paths into labyrinths of white. I sought shelter in an abandoned watchtower, thinking I would wait out the storm. I didn't know that winter here didn't ask permission. It simply took hold and refused to let go. The fire had died on the 2nd day. My supplies ran out on the 3rd. And then the cold began its patient work, pressing against the stones, seeping through every crack, filling the tower like water rising in a well. I had tried to leave that morning, but the door was sealed shut by ice, the hinges frozen solid. The windows were too narrow for escape. I was a prisoner of winter itself, but someone had seen my smoke before the fire died. Someone was coming. I watched the torch grow larger, closer, its light throwing strange shadows on the snow. Other figures moved alongside it, dark shapes I could barely distinguish from the trees. They moved with purpose, with knowledge of this land that I desperately lacked. I tried to call out, but my voice came as barely a whisper, my throat too cold to form proper sound. They reached the tower's base. I heard voices, low, measured, speaking a language I didn't recognize. Tools struck against ice. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming, if the cold had finally pulled me into hallucination. But then I heard it clearly. The crack of ice breaking, the groan of the door giving way, and the rush of even colder air up the tower stairs. The torch appeared first, held high by a man whose face was wrapped in furs, only his eyes visible. Dark eyes that studied me with neither pity nor judgment, but with a kind of... The old keeper of our monastery had once told me that there are moments in life when a door closes and another opens. But he never mentioned that sometimes the person who opens that door changes everything that comes after. The torchbearer stepped into the room, and behind him came others. 5, maybe 6 people, all dressed in furs and leather, their faces weathered by a lifetime of this cold. They moved with the efficiency of those who had done this before, who understood rescue not as heroism, but as simple necessity. The torchbearer spoke. His words were foreign, but his gesture was universal. He extended his hand. I took it, and with that simple act, my old life ended. They wrapped me in furs that smelled of smoke and animal fat. Someone pressed a waterskin to my lips, liquid that burned going down but spread warmth through my chest like sunlight. They didn't hurry, didn't panic. They worked with calm precision, checking my fingers and toes for frostbite, rubbing circulation back into my limbs. Through it all, they spoke to each other in that melodic, unfamiliar tongue, their voices carrying neither alarm nor celebration. This was just what they did. This was their way. When they were satisfied I could walk, they helped me down the tower stairs. The cold outside hit me like a wall, but it was different now. I wasn't facing it alone. The torch-bearer led the way, and the others formed a loose circle around me, shielding me from the worst of the wind with their own bodies. We began to move through the forest, following a path I couldn't see, but they navigated with absolute certainty. I tried to speak, to thank them, but one of them, a younger man with kind eyes, simply shook his head and smiled. Not yet. There would be time for words later. For now, we walked. The forest at night was a cathedral of shadows and snow. Moonlight filtered through branches heavy with ice, creating pillars of silver light. Our footsteps crunched in rhythm, a percussion that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of this frozen world. I found myself falling into step with them, matching their pace, their breathing. Without understanding their language, I was learning their first lesson. Survival is a dance with the land, and you must move to its rhythm, not your own. We walked for what felt like hours. My legs burned. My lungs ached from the cold air. But whenever I faltered, a hand would steady me. Sometimes the young man, sometimes a woman whose face remained hidden behind a fur hood. Sometimes others whose features I couldn't yet distinguish in the darkness. They passed the torch between them, never letting it go out, that small flame our beacon through the endless night. And then I saw it. Lights ahead. Not just one torch, but many. A cluster of them, glowing warm against the snow. As we drew closer, I could make out structures. Low buildings made of stone and timber, their roofs heavy with snow. Smoke rose from several chimneys, gray columns climbing toward the stars. The smell of burning wood and cooking food reached me, and my stomach clenched with sudden hunger. We had arrived at their village. But this was only the beginning of my true journey. The village was built into the landscape itself, as if it had grown from the snow rather than been constructed upon it. The buildings were half buried, their walls thick and windowless on the sides facing the prevailing wind. Narrow paths connected the structures, worn smooth by countless feet. Everywhere I looked, I saw adaptation. This was a place designed not to conquer the cold, but to survive within it, to make peace with winter's relentless presence. The torchbearer led me to the largest building. Its door was low, forcing everyone to bow as they entered, a gesture that seemed both practical and symbolic. Inside, warmth hit me like an embrace. A central fire pit dominated the space, flames dancing beneath a cleverly designed smoke hole. People looked up as we entered, old and young, men and women, children, all with the same weathered features, the same calm acceptance in their eyes. The torchbearer spoke to an older man who sat closest to the fire. This man's hair was white as the snow outside, his face a map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He said something that made several people smile. The young man who had walked beside me touched my arm and gestured toward a spot near the fire. "Sit rest. You are safe now. They brought me food, a stew of meat and roots that I couldn't identify but tasted better than anything I'd ever eaten. They brought me thick blankets. They tended to my frostbitten fingers with a salve that stung but soothed. Through it all, they watched me with curiosity but not intrusion. They were allowing me space to recover, to adjust, to begin understanding that I was no longer in my world but theirs. That first night, I slept by the fire while the village continued its life around me. I heard children laughing, heard the low murmur of adult conversation, heard someone singing a melody that seemed to capture both the harshness and beauty of this place. And for the first time since the snow began, I felt something other than fear. I felt the possibility of hope. Morning came with pale light filtering through the smoke hole. The fire had been tended through the night. It never went out, I would later learn, maintained by a rotation of villagers who understood that in this land a dead fire meant dead people. I woke to find the white-haired elder sitting nearby, watching me with those sharp eyes. "Tuluk," he said, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to me, eyebrows raised in question. "Edmund," I managed, my voice still rough from the cold. He repeated it, mangling the pronunciation in a way that made several nearby people chuckle. "Edmund." He tried again, getting closer. Then he said something else, a string of words in his language, and gestured broadly. At the village, the people, the fire. Though I couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear enough. You are here now. You are with us. Over the following days, I began to learn their ways. The young man who had walked beside me that first night became my primary guide. His name was Anik, and he had a gift for communication that transcended language barriers. Through gestures, demonstrations, and endless patience, he began teaching me the fundamentals of survival in this harsh place. The first lesson was fire. Not just how to make it, I knew that much from my monastery days, but how to respect it, tend it, read it. Anik showed me how they collected specific types of wood, how they dried it in special racks near the fires, how they never took more than they needed from any one area. The forest was their ally, but only if they treated it with reverence. The second lesson was ice. Ice was not just frozen water here. It was a language, a warning system, a tool. Anik taught me to listen to it, to the songs it sang under pressure, to the groans that meant danger. He showed me which ice was safe to walk on, and which would betray you. He demonstrated how to cut blocks for building, how to use snow itself as insulation. The third lesson was community. In this place, survival wasn't individual. It was collective. Every person had roles, responsibilities. Everyone contributed according to their abilities. The elderly weren't burdens but treasures, repositories of knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Children weren't. Tuluk, the white-haired elder, called everyone to gather on my fifth night in the village. People assembled in the main hall, the children finding spots close to the fire, the adults arranging themselves in a loose circle. This was clearly a ritual, something that happened regularly. Tuluk began to speak, his voice rising and falling like wind over snow, and though I couldn't understand his words, I was captivated by his presence. This was a story, I realized. He was telling them a story. Anik leaned close and whispered translations in my ear. Broken, simplified, but enough to follow the thread. It was a tale of the ancestors, of people who had wandered these lands before memory, learning the ways of survival through trial and terrible cost. They had made mistakes, Tuluk said, thinking themselves above the land, thinking they could take without giving, and the land had taught them otherwise. It taught them through hunger, through cold, through loss. But those who listened, who learned humility, who understood they were part of the land rather than masters of it, they survived, they thrived, they became the people sitting in this circle now. The story went on, weaving between myth and practical wisdom, between entertainment and education. I realized this was how knowledge was preserved here, passed down through generations not in written texts, but in spoken word, in tales that children would remember and retell, keeping the wisdom alive. When Tuluk finished, there was a moment of reverential silence. Then the children asked questions, and the adults offered their own interpretations, their own experiences that echoed the ancient story. It was a living tradition, constantly renewed, constantly relevant. That night, lying in my sleeping furs, I thought about my monastery's library, all those carefully preserved texts, those words locked away where only the educated could access them. Here, knowledge flowed freely, available to all, renewed with each telling. There was wisdom in that which I was only beginning to appreciate. The winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the cold more intense. But within the village, life continued with a rhythm I found increasingly beautiful. People rose before dawn to tend the fires. They prepared food together, sharing tasks and stories. They crafted tools and clothing by firelight, their hands never idle. They sang songs that seemed to keep the darkness at bay. And slowly, incredibly, they were teaching me their language. Anik was my primary teacher, but everyone participated. The children especially seemed to take delight in correcting my pronunciation, giggling when I mangled simple words. An older woman named Nivi taught me the names of tools and materials. A man called Kanak showed me hunting terms and animal signs. Even Tuluk would sometimes pause in his storytelling to make sure I understood a particularly important word. Language opened doors. With each new word I learned, I understood more of their world. I learned that they called themselves the Inuit, the people. I learned that this village, this warmth in the endless cold, was called Iqaluit. I learned that the land around us, this frozen expanse I had once seen as enemy territory, they called Nunavut, our land. Our land. Not a thing to be conquered, but a home to be understood and respected. Winter solstice approached, the longest night of the year. I had lived with the Inuit for nearly 2 months, and I could feel something building in the village. An anticipation, a preparation for something significant. People were crafting special items, gathering specific materials. There was more laughter, more music in the evenings. Even the children seemed to vibrate with excitement. Anik found me one morning and gestured for me to follow. We walked to the edge of the village where a group of men were working on something I hadn't seen before. A large sled made of bone and hide, elegant in its simplicity, yet clearly strong enough to bear heavy loads. Dogs were tethered nearby, not the hunting dogs I'd seen before, but larger animals with thick coats and intelligent eyes. "We go," Anik said in his limited vocabulary of my language, gesturing at the horizon. "You come." My heart jumped. A journey, beyond the village, into the vast white landscape I'd only glimpsed from the village's edge. The preparation took 2 more days. I watched as they packed the sled with careful precision. Food, furs, tools, materials for making shelter. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. Every item had its place, its purpose. Kanak, who I'd learned was the village's lead hunter, checked and rechecked everything with the meticulousness of someone who understood that small oversights could mean disaster. There would be 8 of us making this journey. Kanak would lead. Tuluk would come. The old storyteller's presence both surprising and somehow fitting. Anik, of course. Nevi, the older woman. A quiet man named Kanak. A younger woman called Arnak. Her brother Tavik. And me. The night before departure, Tuluk told another story. This one was about a journey taken long ago, about people who had traveled across the ice to find new hunting grounds when the old ones failed. It was a story of hardship and courage, of people who had trusted each other and the land itself to guide them through impossible conditions. And they had succeeded. They had survived. The story was for me, I realized. Everyone in the circle already knew it. They'd heard it countless times since childhood. But Tuluk was telling it now, on this night, so that I would understand what we were about to do. This wasn't adventure or exploration for its own sake. This was survival. This was life. We left at dawn. The dogs were harnessed, eager and strong. The sled was loaded. The village gathered to see us off. A ritual of departure that involved touches, words, small gifts pressed into hands. A young woman I'd seen often near the fires approached me and held out something wrapped in cloth. Inside was dried meat and a small carved figure. An animal I couldn't identify, but which felt important, sacred even. Amaruk, she said softly. Wolf, for protection. I thanked her in her language, my pronunciation still clumsy but sincere. She smiled and stepped back into the crowd. Then we were moving. The dogs pulling with disciplined power, Kanak calling commands I was learning to recognize, the sled gliding over snow with a whisper that was almost musical. The village receded behind us, grew smaller, became a memory of warmth as we entered the vast emptiness of winter. The land here was not truly empty, I was learning. It only seemed that way to untrained eyes. Kanak and the others read it like a text, seeing stories in tracks, in the way snow drifted, in the subtle changes of ice. They navigated by sun and stars, by wind patterns, by knowledge so deep it seemed instinctual. We traveled in silence mostly. Conversation was occasional, minimal. The cold made talking difficult, and besides, there was a kind of meditation in this movement, in becoming part of the landscape's rhythm. I found myself falling into it, my breathing matching the pace of the dogs, my thoughts slowing to match the endless white horizon. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, low, pale, offering light but little warmth. We stopped once to rest the dogs and eat. Nevi produced hot broth from an insulated container. I had no idea how she'd kept it warm, and we passed it around, sharing from the same vessel, each person taking only enough before passing it on. This sharing, I was realizing, was everything here. Not politeness or virtue, but survival itself. In a land where resources were limited and the margin for error non-existent, selfishness was a death sentence. Generosity wasn't noble. It was the only way to live. We traveled until the light began to fade. Then Kanak made a decision. I could see it in the way he studied the landscape, the way he consulted silently with Tuluk. We would make camp. The dogs sensed it too, their pace quickening slightly as they pulled us toward a spot that looked to my eyes identical to everywhere else we'd been. But Kanak knew something I didn't. When we stopped, I understood. There was a slight rise here, protection from wind. The snow had a different quality, more compact, better for building. Within minutes, the group was working with practiced efficiency. Some tended the dogs. Others began cutting snow blocks. Tuluk and Nevi set up what would become our. Within an hour, a shelter stood where there had been nothing. They called it an igloo, a dome of snow blocks fitted so precisely that wind couldn't penetrate, yet air could flow enough to prevent suffocation. It was architecture of pure function, beautiful in its simplicity. A tunnel entrance kept wind out while allowing access. Inside, they laid down layers of caribou hide and furs, creating a floor that would insulate us from the frozen ground. They lit a small oil lamp. Seal oil, I would learn, and the transformation was immediate. The igloo began to warm, the interior walls slightly melting and then refreezing, creating a smooth, crystalline surface that reflected and amplified the lamp's light. It was a cave of ice and light, intimate and otherworldly. We ate together in that space, our voices soft, our movements constrained by the close quarters but comfortable in a way I was beginning to understand. Closeness here wasn't invasion. It was survival. Body heat shared was warmth multiplied. Stories told in this small space weren't just entertainment, but affirmation. We are alive, we are together. We will see tomorrow. Tuluk told a story that night about stars. He pointed upward, though we couldn't see through the igloo's roof, and spoke about the patterns above us. Anik translated what he could. The stars weren't just lights, Tuluk said. They were ancestors watching over the people. They were guides, showing the way when land itself became indistinguishable. They were teachers, reminding those who watched them that there was something beyond the immediate struggle, something vast and eternal. I thought of my monastery's astronomy texts, their careful calculations and theories. They had understood stars as objects to be studied, measured, explained. But Tuluk's people understood them as family, as living presence, as connection between earth and something greater. Both types of knowledge had truth in them. That night, sleeping in the close warmth of the igloo, surrounded by the breathing of my companions, I realized something that would have scandalized my abbot. I was happier here, in this frozen shelter miles from anywhere, than I had ever been in the monastery's stone walls. We woke to a new sound. Wind, but not just wind. Something larger, more powerful. Kanak was already awake, listening. He exchanged glances with Tuluk. Words passed between them, quick and serious. Then Kanak looked at me and said something I'd learned meant wait, or patience. A storm was coming. We would stay in the igloo. The wind rose through the morning, howling across the ice with a voice that sounded almost alive. Snow began to fall, not gently, but horizontally, driven by wind that seemed determined to scour everything from the face of the earth. Inside our shelter, we were safe, but we could hear the storm's fury, feel the igloo shudder slightly under the onslaught. This was what I would have faced alone in that tower if they hadn't found me. This was what I couldn't have survived without their knowledge, their shelter, their companionship. The realization was humbling. We stayed in the igloo for a day and a night while the storm raged. It could have been tedious, claustrophobic. Instead, it became something else, an intensive course in their culture, their wisdom, their way of seeing the world. Trapped together with nothing to do but talk and share, they opened their knowledge to me. Nevi taught me about sewing, not just how to make stitches, but the philosophy behind their clothing. Every piece was designed for survival. Seams had to be waterproof. Materials had to breathe while insulating. Nothing could chafe during long movement. She showed me mittens with a design that seemed simple but was actually genius. An outer layer that could be removed to allow fine work. An inner layer that preserved warmth. Each stitch was placed with purpose. Kanak, who had been mostly silent until now, showed me how they made tools. From bone, from stone, from the materials the land provided. He explained how nothing was wasted. A caribou provided meat, hide for clothing and shelter, bone for tools and needles, sinew for thread and bowstrings, fat for oil, and the storm ended as suddenly as it began. One moment the wind was screaming. The next there was silence so profound it seemed to ring in my ears. Kanak went outside first, checking conditions. When he returned, he was smiling. The first real smile I'd seen from him. He spoke rapidly, and though I caught only pieces of it, Anik's translation made me understand. The storm had been perfect. It had cleared away old snow, packed the surface hard. We could travel fast now, faster than before. This wasn't a setback. It was a gift. We broke camp with the same efficiency we'd built it. The igloo was abandoned. They would build another when needed. Nothing was carried that didn't serve immediate purpose. Even the structure that had sheltered us was left to the wind and snow, to eventually melt back into the landscape from which it came. The dogs were restless, eager to run. When Kanak gave the command, they lunged forward with joy, pulling the sled across the packed snow at a speed that took my breath away. The landscape blurred past, endless white, broken only by the occasional dark stone or distant ridge. We flew across it like a bird, like wind itself. For hours we traveled like this, stopping only briefly to rest the dogs and adjust our course. The sun tracked across the southern horizon, never rising high but painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. The beauty of it was almost painful, this vast emptiness that was somehow full of life, full of meaning. Arnak, the young woman, moved up beside me on the sled during one of our brief stops. She'd been quiet most of the journey, but now she pointed at something in the distance, a dark shape against the white. Her brother Tavik said something that made everyone alert, interested. Caribou. A herd of them, moving across the plain. What happened next was a demonstration of coordination so perfect it seemed choreographed. Without apparent discussion, the group split. Kanak, and Tavik took the hunting tools and moved off on foot, approaching downwind. The rest of us waited with the sled and dogs, keeping them quiet and still. I watched, fascinated, as the three hunters became part of the landscape, moving with a patience that seemed superhuman to my monastery-trained mind. The hunt took hours. The caribou grazed, unaware. The hunters moved closer by increments so small I could barely detect their progress. Then, at some invisible signal, movement happened fast. The lead hunter, Kanak, rose and threw. His spear flew true. The caribou scattered, but one stumbled, fell. There was no celebration, no triumph. The hunters approached the fallen animal with what looked like reverence. Tuluk, who had been watching beside me, began to speak. Low words that Anik told me were thanks. Thanks to the animal for giving its life. Thanks to the land for providing. Thanks to the ancestors for teaching them this way. The butchering was efficient and respectful. Every part of the animal was used or saved. The meat was divided among all of us, not according to who killed or who was strongest, but according to need. Tuluk, as the eldest, received choice portions. The young people received more because they needed energy for growth and work. I received my share without question, without special treatment or exemption. I was one of them now, I realized. Not a guest, not a rescued stranger. One of them. That night's camp was celebratory in the quiet way of these people. They didn't shout or boast, but there was extra oil for the lamp, making it brighter. There was fresh meat, cooked and tender. There were smiles and gentle touches, acknowledgments of a successful hunt, of continued survival, of another day won against the odds. Tuluk told a story about the first hunters, about how they learned to honor the animals that gave their lives so people could eat. It was a complex tale involving transformation and responsibility, about understanding that taking life required humility and gratitude. The caribou, he said, chose to give themselves to hunters who approached with respect. Hunters who took with arrogance would find only empty plains. Myth and practical wisdom intertwined in a way that made both more powerful. Respect the animals, approach with humility, use everything you take. These weren't just nice ideas, but survival strategies encoded in story so they would be remembered and passed on. I fell asleep that night thinking about the manuscripts I'd copied in the monastery. Religious texts, philosophical treatises, scientific observations, all valuable, all important. But had any of them taught me as much about how to actually live as these few weeks among the Inuit? Had any of them shown me what it meant to be truly part of something larger than myself? We traveled for 6 more days. The landscape changed subtly. More rocky outcrops, occasional glimpses of open water where the ice had cracked. Kanak became more cautious, testing ice before committing the dogs and sled to it. Once we had to backtrack and find another route, adding hours to our journey but ensuring safety. Tavik walked beside me during one of these detours and told me, in gestures and the words we now shared, about the dangers of ice. How it could look solid but be weak underneath. How currents could eat away at it from below. How the sound of running water under ice was both beautiful and terrifying. Many people, he said, had been lost to the ice. Some bodies were never recovered, taken by the water, becoming part of the land they had lived on. It wasn't said with fear, exactly, more with acceptance. This was the reality of their world. Death was always close, always possible. That didn't make them careless. Quite the opposite. It made them careful, respectful, aware. Every decision was weighed against survival. Every action considered for its consequences. But it also made them alive in a way I'd never experienced in the monastery. We had been contemplating death, preparing for an afterlife, treating this world as a temporary trial to be endured. These people lived fully in the present, aware of death but not obsessed with it, engaged with life in all its immediate, demanding reality. On the 7th day, Kanak stopped the sled and pointed. There, in the distance, was something I'd almost forgotten existed. Trees. Not many, stunted and bent by wind, but trees nonetheless. And beyond them, smoke rising from chimneys. Another village. We had arrived at our destination. This village was larger than Iqaluit, built along a coastline where sea ice met land. The buildings were similar but more numerous, and there was an energy here that felt different. Busier, more connected to some larger network. People came out to greet us, and I was struck by how this happened. No surprise, no alarm at seeing strangers. Just recognition, welcome, the easy hospitality of people who understood that In this land, travelers were to be greeted with warmth and shelter. An older woman approached Tuluk with obvious respect and affection. They spoke for several minutes, occasionally glancing at me. Then she turned and looked at me directly, her eyes shrewd and assessing. She said something that made several people laugh, not unkindly, but with genuine humor. Anik leaned close. "She says you don't look like much, but if Tuluk brought you this far, you must have something worth keeping." I felt myself flush, not with embarrassment, but with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Pride, belonging, the simple pleasure of being acknowledged, assessed, and found adequate. The woman's name was Siku, and she was clearly someone important here. Not a ruler or chief, but someone whose opinion mattered, whose voice carried weight. She invited us into the largest building where a fire already burned and food was being prepared. As we entered, I noticed something that made my heart skip. On one wall hung what looked like maps, drawings on stretched hide, showing coastlines, ice patterns, hunting grounds. They were unlike any maps I'd seen in the monastery, less concerned with precise measurements and more focused on practical knowledge. Here be good fishing. Here the ice is treacherous in spring. Here is where the caribou migration passes. These were documents of survival, passed down and updated by generations. They were literature and science combined, storytelling and observation merged into tools for living. I approached them reverently, and Siku noticed my interest. She came to stand beside me and began explaining what I was seeing. Through Anik's translation and my growing language skills, I learned that what I was looking at was the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Every mark had meaning. Every symbol told a story. And these maps weren't static. They were constantly revised, updated as the land changed, as ice patterns shifted, as new information was gathered and verified. "The land teaches," Siku said, her words slow enough for me to understand directly. "We only record what the land shows." The feast that night was magnificent by their standards. Fish and seal meat, berries preserved in fat, roots that had been cached in ice pits. The whole village gathered, and Tuluk was clearly the guest of honor. He told stories of our journey, of the storm, of the caribou hunt. He spoke with dramatic flair that had children wide-eyed and adults nodding in recognition of the truths embedded in his tale. And then he did something that shocked me. He began telling a story about me, about the man found in the frozen tower, more dead than alive, about teaching me to survive, to listen, to learn, about how stubbornness and pride could kill, but humility and willingness to change could save. It wasn't mocking, it was mythologizing, turning my rescue and education into a teaching story, into something that would be remembered and retold. I was becoming part of their oral history, woven into the fabric of their culture. The celebration continued late into the night. There was drum singing, voices and rhythm combining into something that seemed to vibrate in my chest, in my bones. There was dancing, not wild but measured, movements that told stories of animals and seasons and journeys. There was laughter and food, and the comfort of community celebrating simply being alive. I found myself sitting beside Arnak, who had been quiet most of our journey but now seemed more relaxed, more open. She asked me about my old life, the monastery, the books, the life of sitting and writing while others worked the land. I tried to explain it in my limited vocabulary, and she listened with genuine interest. "No hunting, no fishing?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Others did that for us," I said. We thought about God. We wrote about God. She considered this. Your God is different from ours. We don't write about the spirits. We live with them. They are in the ice, in the animals, in the wind. We speak to them, they answer. No writing needed. It wasn't said as criticism, just observation. And she was right. Their spirituality was immediate, practical, woven into every action of daily life. Mine had been abstract, theoretical, separated from the physical world. Which is better? I asked. She smiled. Maybe both are true. Maybe there are many ways to understand what is bigger than us. The wisdom of it struck me. She was younger than me, had never learned to read or write, had never traveled beyond a few days' journey from where she was born. Yet she had understanding that many learned monks would never achieve. We stayed in the coastal village for 12 days, long enough to rest, to trade goods, to share knowledge. I spent hours studying their maps, learning from Siku how they read ice and weather, how they predicted animal movements. She was a teacher by nature, patient but exacting, demanding that I truly understand rather than just memorize. Understanding means you can adapt, she explained. Memory fails, conditions change. But if you understand why, you can figure out what to do when something new happens. I helped where I could, carrying water from ice holes, helping to repair sleds, watching as master craftspeople made tools and taught younger ones. I was useless at most tasks, my monastery-softened hands clumsy with practical work. But I tried, and my willingness to fail and learn seemed to be what mattered. Kanak, who had remained largely silent throughout our journey, approached me one afternoon. He held out a partially carved piece of bone and gestured for me to take it. Then he gave me a tool and showed me, slowly, how to work the material. Not the finished product. That would take skills I didn't have. But the beginning, the basic technique. Small work now, he said in his limited words. Big work later. All things grow from small. It was perhaps the longest statement I'd heard from him, and it resonated deeper than he might have intended. All things grow from small. My first words in their language, my first successful fire, my first understood story. All small things that were building toward something larger. The night before we were to return to Iqaluit, Tuluk found me sitting outside, watching stars. He sat beside me in comfortable silence for a long time before speaking. You came from far away, he said. Not just distance, different world. Yes, I agreed. You go back? The question hung in the cold air between us. Go back? To the monastery, to my old life, to walls and written words and separation from the physical world. I don't know, I admitted. Tuluk nodded as if this was the answer he expected. Good. Man who knows everything learns nothing. Man who doesn't know, he can become anything. He stood to go, then paused. The ice teaches this. Hold too tight, you break. Move with it. Bend with it. You survive. Same with life. You understand. I did. I was beginning to. The journey back to Iqaluit was faster. Our route now familiar. The dogs eager to return home. But I was different than I'd been on the outward journey. I moved with more confidence, read the landscape better, understood the rhythm of travel. When we stopped to build an igloo, I didn't just watch. I helped, my hands still clumsy but willing, my efforts earnest if not expert. Kanak acknowledged this with a nod, the highest praise he seemed capable of giving. It meant more to me than elaborate compliments ever had in the monastery. We stopped one final night before reaching Iqaluit. The aurora borealis appeared, dancing lights that turned the night sky into a cathedral of color. Green and purple waves undulated across the darkness, silent and magnificent. I had seen them before during my time here, but this night they seemed particularly vivid, particularly alive. Tuluk spoke quietly beside me. "The ancestors dance," he said. "They celebrate. They welcome." I turned to him. "Welcome who?" He looked at me with those sharp old eyes, and I saw something in them. Affection, perhaps. Recognition. "You," he said simply. "They welcome you." We reached Iqaluit the next day. The village appeared on the horizon like a promise fulfilled. Smoke rising from familiar structures, people emerging to greet us. The young woman who had given me the wolf carving was there, smiling. Children ran forward, eager to hear stories of our journey. The entire community turned out, not with fanfare but with the quiet pleasure of family reuniting. I realized, standing there being welcomed back, that this was home now. Not the monastery where I'd spent years, not the country of my birth. This place, these people, this way of life that had seemed so foreign just months ago. I was home. The seasons turned. Spring came with its own dangers, melting ice, flooding, the challenge of moving camps to follow game. I learned new skills, new words, new ways of reading the land. Summer brought endless daylight and swarms of insects, and the frenetic energy of people preparing for winter's return. Fall brought the caribou migration and intensive hunting, and the work of preserving food for dark months ahead. Through it all, I was learning, growing, becoming something new. The monastery felt like a dream from someone else's life. My old name, Edmund, was used less and less. They had given me a new one, Takik. It meant shadow, Anik explained, because I had arrived like a shadow, barely alive, and they had given me substance. Years passed. I taught the children to read and write, not in my old language, but in theirs, creating a written version of their tongue so their stories could be preserved in a new way, without losing their oral power. The elders were skeptical at first, but when they saw that writing didn't replace storytelling but complemented it, they accepted it. I married. Arnak and I built our life together, merging my growing knowledge with her lifelong wisdom. We had children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up bilingual, bicultural, able to navigate both the oral traditions of their mother's people and the written traditions I could teach them. Tuluk grew older, his hair even whiter, his movements slower. But his mind remained sharp, his stories still captivating. One winter night, when he was very old and I was middle-aged, he called me to sit beside him. "When I found you in that tower," he said, "I saw something others didn't. Not a foreign fool to be rescued and sent away. I saw someone who could become one of us. Was I right?" I thought about my answer carefully. "You were right, but not because of what you saw in me. Because of what you and your people gave me. The chance to become something I didn't know I could be." He smiled. "Good answer. Shows wisdom. You will tell the stories when I'm gone?" The thought of Tuluk gone was painful, but I knew it was coming. We all did. "If the people will listen to me," I said. "They will listen," he assured me. "Because you know something now that you didn't know then. You know that survival isn't about fighting the world. It's about becoming part of it. That's the only story that matters. Tell it well." Tuluk died that spring, passing quietly in his sleep after a long life fully lived. We honored him as was the custom, returning his body to the land, celebrating his life with stories, ensuring his wisdom lived on in those he'd taught. I told stories of him that night, feeling the weight of responsibility and honor in carrying on his role. More years passed. My daughters grew and married. My son became a skilled hunter like Kanak, who was now the elder statesman of the village. Nevi grew very old and eventually joined the ancestors. Anik, my first friend here, became the village's primary teacher of youth, passing on the practical skills every young person needed. And I became the storyteller, the keeper of oral history, the one who ensured the past informed the present. I told the old stories Tuluk had told, of ancestors and animals and the land's teachings. But I also told new stories, including my own. The story of the man in the frozen tower. The story of being welcomed. The story of learning to see the world through different eyes. Young people would sometimes ask me about my old life, about the world I came from. I would tell them truthfully. It was a different place with different ways, neither better nor worse, just different. But I would also tell them that I had found something here that I never had there. I had found my place, my purpose, my people. But you weren't born here, they would say, confused. How can this be your place? Place isn't where you're born, I would explain. Place is where you belong, where you contribute, where you're welcomed not as a stranger but as family. I was born far away, but I belong here. One autumn, when I was old enough to feel winters in my bones, a stranger appeared at the village edge. Not frozen or dying, but lost nonetheless. He was from a traders' group that had gotten separated in a storm. He spoke a language similar to my old one, and when the villagers realized I could communicate with him, they brought him to me. Looking at him, frightened, confused, overwhelmed by this place and these people, I saw myself decades ago. And I knew what I had to do. I welcomed him. I taught him his first words of the language. I showed him how to dress for the cold, how to read ice, how to survive. And more importantly, I showed him what Tuluk and Kanak and Anik and all the others had shown me. That survival isn't individual but collective. That welcoming the stranger is how a community stays strong. That teaching is how knowledge lives forever. He learned quickly, just as I had. And watching him become part of the community, watching him transform from outsider to insider, I understood something profound. This was the cycle. This was how cultures survived, by welcoming new blood, new perspectives, new people who brought their own gifts and learned the gifts of others. I am very old now. My hands shake when I carve. My eyes are weak in dim light. My wife Arnak tends me with the same patience I showed her when we were young, and she taught me so much. Our grandchildren visit and ask for stories, and I tell them. My voice still strong even if my body weakens. But before I join the ancestors, before I become one of the lights dancing in the aurora, I wanted to share this story one last time. The story of how I was lost and found, how I was welcomed, how I learned that home isn't a place you're born, but a place that accepts you, teaches you, transforms you. I tell you this story not because my life was exceptional, quite the opposite. I tell it because it's the most ordinary story in the world, the story of someone finding where they belong. Many people never find it. Some search their whole lives. I was fortunate. I was found when I needed finding. I was taught when I needed teaching. I was welcomed when I needed welcoming. And now, as I near the end of my journey, I pass this story on to you. If you've found something meaningful in these words, if this tale of survival and belonging resonates with you, do me one kindness. Subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one, more journeys of transformation and discovery. Let my words find others who might need them, just as I needed the wisdom of Tuluk and his people all those years ago. The tower is still there, I'm told, still standing in that forest, still freezing solid every winter. But it's empty now. No one to rescue, no one to save. Perhaps one day another traveler will seek shelter there, will face the cold, will wonder if they'll survive. And perhaps someone will see their smoke, will bring a torch through the dark forest, will offer a hand instead of letting them face the ice alone. That's what I learned in my years with the Inuit. That's what Tuluk taught me, what Anik showed me, what every member of that community demonstrated daily. We survive together, or we don't survive at all. The cold is vast and indifferent. But people can choose warmth. People can choose connection. People can choose to be the torch in the darkness for someone else. I was the man in the frozen tower. But I became something more. A father, a husband, a storyteller, a member of a community that saved me in every way a person can be saved. Not just my body, but my soul. Not just my life, but my purpose. And if you're reading this, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey from that frozen tower to this warm home filled with family and memories, then perhaps you understand what I'm really saying. We are all, in some way, trapped in towers, isolated, cold, waiting for connection. And we can all be the ones carrying the torch, moving through darkness to find those who need finding. That's the lesson. That's what I learned in the ice and snow and in the warmth of people who had every reason to leave me, but chose instead to welcome me. We are not meant to survive alone. We are meant to find each other, help each other, teach each other. We are meant to become, together, something more than we could ever be apart. The aurora dances tonight as I finish this story. I can see it through the window, green and purple waves across the darkness. The ancestors are celebrating, Tuluk would have said. They're welcoming someone new. Maybe one day they'll welcome you too when your time comes. But until then, carry the torch. Be the warmth in someone's cold. Be the hand reaching out, because someone did that for you once, even if you don't remember. Someone taught you your first words, showed you how to survive, welcomed you when you were vulnerable. That's how humanity works. That's how we all make it through the long winter. My name is Takik, though I was born Edmund. I was a stranger who became family. I was lost and was found. I was cold and was warmed. And I've spent my life since trying to pass on what was given to me. Not just survival skills, but the deeper knowledge that we belong to each other, that community is everything, that the torch in the darkness is always worth carrying. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for traveling with me from that frozen tower to this warm home. If these words touched you, if this journey meant something, honor it by sharing it. Subscribe, like, comment. Let others find what you found here. Let the story continue beyond my telling of it, because that's how knowledge survives. That's how wisdom lives beyond one person's life. We pass it on, generation to generation, story to story, heart to heart. And in doing so, we ensure that no one has to face the cold alone. Ever. The torch is in your hands now. Carry it well.